When people think about a major California earthquake, one name usually comes to mind: the San Andreas Fault. For decades, it has been treated like the main threat. It appears on earthquake maps. It drives emergency drills. Insurance companies plan around it. State agencies build disaster scenarios around it. People have been told to watch the east. That is where the big one is supposed to come from. But there is one major problem with that picture. The San Andreas Fault is about 50 miles from downtown Los Angeles. Puente Hills is not 50 miles away. It runs directly underneath the city, under neighborhoods, office buildings, freeways, transit lines, hospitals, apartments, places filled with people every single day. And Puente Hills is not the same kind of fault. The San Andreas mainly moves sideways. Two sections of the earth slide past each other. Puente Hills pushes upward. It is a thrust fault. One section of rock is forced over another, lifting and bending the ground above it. There is another huge difference. You can often see evidence of the San Andreas at the surface. It can offset roads, streams, fences, and hillsides. In some places, you can stand right beside the fault and see where the earth moved. Puente Hills does not leave that kind of scar. Its rupture stops a few miles below the surface. Instead of breaking through the ground, it slowly bends the layers above it. That makes it incredibly hard to notice. To someone driving through Los Angeles, the signs might look like nothing more than a gentle rise in the road, a small slope, a shape in the landscape no one would think twice about. That is why the fault stayed out of sight for so long. It was not sitting in some remote desert. It was beneath one of the busiest cities in America. So the real question is not just why everyone focused on the San Andreas. The real question is this: how could a fault stretching for dozens of miles sit directly beneath Los Angeles without anyone realizing what it was? Near the end of 1998, a box arrived at John Shaw's office. Inside were magnetic tapes and stacks of printed seismic records. The data had been collected by oil companies going all the way back to the 1960s. At the time, those companies were not thinking about earthquakes. They were looking for oil. To do that, they sent sound waves deep into the ground. When those waves bounced back, they created an underground picture. The records showed rock layers, folds, slopes, hidden structures buried far below Los Angeles. For years, thousands of petroleum engineers had worked with this information, but they were trained to look for places where oil and gas might collect. They were not looking for a dangerous fault beneath the city. That difference mattered. John Shaw had been trained to recognize blind thrust faults. These faults do not reach the surface, so they do not leave an obvious crack in the ground. Instead, they reveal themselves through the way the rock layers above them bend and fold. Shaw began going through the records one line at a time. The more he looked, the clearer the pattern became. A sloping structure appeared beneath the northern Los Angeles basin. It kept showing up again and again, stretching from the area near Griffith Park toward La Habra. This was not just a random rock layer. The angle was too consistent. The shape was too large. And the same pattern appeared across separate scans taken in different places and at different times. It looked like a fault ramp, a major one. The strange part is that the evidence had been there for decades. It had passed through countless hands. It had been stored, copied, studied, and used. But no one had asked the question John Shaw was asking. That may be the biggest lesson in this whole story. The data was not exactly hidden. It was sitting in plain sight. People just had not looked at it through the right lens. As John Shaw kept studying the data, he realized something important. This was not one single fault surface. It was three separate segments. The western segment sits beneath Bunker Hill and downtown Los Angeles. The middle segment runs under Whittier. The eastern segment lies beneath the Coyote Hills. Each one is about 9 miles long. At first, that might sound less dangerous than one giant fault. But it is not that simple. The ends of these segments overlap. Their deeper sections also connect closely beneath the ground. That means a rupture may not stay inside one section. If one segment starts to break, the movement could continue into the next one, then possibly into the third. The fault does not need to split open as one clean line across the surface. In fact, it never reaches the surface at all. The real danger is underground. 3 separate sections can still move during the same major earthquake. One can pass energy into another, creating a much larger event than a small rupture on a single segment. And there was more evidence. When Shaw compared the oil company's scans with records of small earthquakes around Los Angeles, the patterns matched. Many of those minor quakes lined up along the same sloping underground surface he had seen in the seismic data. 2 completely different sources were pointing to the same structure. The oil scans showed its shape. The earthquake records showed that it was active. That made the picture much harder to dismiss. This was not an old crack buried under the city and doing nothing. It was a living fault system. And it was made of 3 connected pieces sitting beneath some of the most crowded parts of Los Angeles. Puente Hills is what geologists call a blind thrust fault. That word, blind, matters. The fault does not break all the way to the surface. Its movement stops a few miles underground. So when pressure builds and the rocks shift, the ground above does not split open in one obvious line. Instead, the layers of sediment slowly bend. That is what makes this fault so easy to miss. At street level, the signs may look completely normal: a gentle rise in the road, a slight slope across a neighborhood, a curve in the ground that most people would never notice. You could drive over it every day and think nothing of it. For a long time, geologists relied heavily on visible clues at the surface. They looked for streams that had been pushed out of place. They looked for broken cliffs. They looked for land that had clearly risen or dropped. They looked for long cracks cutting across the ground. Those signs are useful because they show where the earth has already broken. But Puente Hills leaves almost none of them. The fault stays underground. The pressure above it is spread through thick layers of soft sediment, so the surface bends instead of tearing. That is why older maps missed it. The methods were built to find scars. Puente Hills did not leave one, and this is also why the word elusive fits better than hidden. The fault was not deliberately covered up. No one buried the evidence or erased it from a map. It was simply difficult to recognize with the tools and methods people were using at the time. The evidence was subtle. Too subtle to see from a sidewalk, a road, or even a traditional geological survey. The fault was there the whole time. The city just did not know how to see it yet. On the morning of the 1st of October, 1987, Los Angeles was already wide awake. It was 7:42 a.m., rush hour. Freeways were packed. Offices were filling up. People were driving to work, dropping off kids, or grabbing coffee before the day started. Then, the ground moved. A magnitude 6 earthquake struck near Whittier Narrows, about 10 miles east of downtown Los Angeles. The shaking reached the city within seconds. 8 people died. Nearly 200 were injured. Damage reached about $358 million at the time. Older brick buildings took some of the worst hits. In uptown Whittier, unreinforced masonry structures cracked, failed, or collapsed. Brick walls and building fronts fell into the streets in other nearby communities. It was a serious earthquake, but the strangest part came afterward. Seismologists could not connect it to any known fault on the map. The usual suspects did not fit. Some were too far away. Others ran in the wrong direction. The aftershocks pointed to a shallow, north-dipping structure buried beneath the eastern Los Angeles basin. But that structure had no name. For years, the earthquake stayed in the record with an unanswered question attached to it. Everyone knew the ground had broken. No one knew exactly what had broken. That changed after the Puente Hills system was identified in 1999. Researchers compared the old aftershock pattern with the newly mapped fault. The match was clear. The 1987 earthquake had struck a small part of the Santa Fe Springs segment of Puente Hills. And that is where the story becomes much more unsettling. The rupture was only a few miles across. It involved a small section of just one segment. It was nowhere close to a full break of the entire system. Yet it still killed people, injured hundreds, and caused major damage across the region. So the real warning from 1987 was not just that Puente Hills could move, it already had. The harder question is what happens when the rupture does not stop at one small section? What happens if one segment breaks, then passes the movement into the next? And what happens if all three move together? The fault is only part of the problem. What sits above it matters just as much. Los Angeles was built on a deep basin filled with miles of soft sediment. Sand, clay, river deposits, and older marine layers have built up there over millions of years. That ground does not react to an earthquake the same way solid rock does. When seismic waves enter soft sediment, they slow down. As they slow down, they can grow stronger. The waves can bounce between underground layers. They can reflect off the edges of the basin. They can overlap, rebuild, and keep the ground moving longer than people might expect. Think of the Los Angeles basin like a large bowl. Strike the bowl, and the sound does not disappear right away. It moves around inside. It echoes. Certain vibrations become louder. The basin can do something similar with earthquake waves. That is what makes Puente Hills especially dangerous. A major San Andreas earthquake would send energy toward downtown from about 50 miles away. Those waves would have to travel through a long stretch of the earth before reaching the city. Puente Hills is already underneath Los Angeles. Its energy does not need to cross 50 miles of crust. It only has to travel a few miles upward. And on the way, it enters the soft sediment beneath the city. Instead of simply absorbing the shaking, those layers can amplify it. That means buildings above the fault may feel stronger and longer shaking than the earthquake's magnitude alone would suggest. This is why distance matters so much. A larger earthquake far away is not always more destructive than a smaller one directly below you. Puente Hills has both advantages working against the city. It is close, and it sits beneath ground that can make the shaking worse. So Los Angeles is not just built over an active fault, it is built over an active fault inside a natural amplifier. In 2005, researchers tried to answer the question everyone was starting to ask. What would happen if the Puente Hills system ruptured in a major earthquake? They modeled an event between magnitudes 7.1 and 7.5. The results were hard to ignore. Estimated economic losses ranged from $82 billion to $252 billion. The model estimated between 3,000 and 18,000 deaths. It also suggested that anywhere from 142,000 to 735,000 households could be forced from their homes. Another 42,000 to 211,000 people might need emergency shelter. Those are enormous numbers, but they need to be understood correctly. This was a loss model, not a prediction. It does not mean a future earthquake will produce those exact results. The real damage would depend on many things: where the rupture begins, how many segments break, what time of day it happens, which buildings are occupied, how well older structures have been reinforced, how quickly emergency crews can respond. Still, the model shows how serious the risk could be. And the reason comes down to location. A major San Andreas earthquake would release more energy overall. On paper, it would be the bigger earthquake, but the San Andreas is about 50 miles from downtown Los Angeles. Puente Hills is directly below the city. Its shaking would not need to travel very far before reaching homes, offices, hospitals, freeways, and apartment buildings. Then, that energy would move through the soft sediment of the Los Angeles basin, where the shaking could become stronger and last longer. That changes everything. Earthquake damage is not based only on magnitude. It also depends on how close the source is, what kind of ground the waves travel through, and what has been built above it. So a Puente Hills earthquake could release less total energy than a major San Andreas event and still cause far more destruction inside Los Angeles. That is the uncomfortable truth. The larger threat is not always the earthquake with the bigger number. Sometimes it is the one happening right under your feet. When people imagine a major earthquake in Los Angeles, they usually picture the skyline coming down, the glass towers, the famous high-rises, the buildings everyone recognizes. But those may not be the weakest part of the city. Many modern skyscrapers were designed under newer seismic codes. Engineers expected them to move during an earthquake. They were built to bend, absorb energy, and stay standing through strong shaking. That does not mean they are invincible, but they are not the main concern. The bigger danger is often found in the buildings people barely notice. Old brick storefronts, aging apartment buildings, concrete structures built before engineers fully understood how buildings fail in earthquakes. Parking garages poured in the 1950s and 1960s. Small medical offices built under outdated codes. Older bridges, freeway supports, and public infrastructure crossing the fault zone. These places were not designed for the kind of shaking Puente Hills could produce. Some have weak walls. Some have poor connections between floors and columns. Others are made from concrete that cannot flex enough when the ground starts moving. And that is when buildings fail. Not always because the shaking is stronger than expected, but because the structure has no safe way to move with it. That is why the most serious casualties may not happen inside the famous towers. They may happen in ordinary places. The apartment where a family is sleeping, the parking structure under an office, the clinic filled with patients, the old building where people have worked for years without ever thinking about the fault below them. The Los Angeles skyline may still be visible after a major earthquake, but the city beneath that skyline could tell a very different story. The buildings that look the least dramatic may be the ones that matter most. Los Angeles was founded in 1781. Back then, it was a small settlement near the river. No skyline, no freeways, no subway system. Just a growing town built around water and open land. Then the city expanded. Through the 1800s and 1900s, Los Angeles became one of the largest cities in the country. Downtown filled with offices. Bunker Hill rose into a business district. City Hall opened. The Aon Center went up. Then came the U.S. Bank Tower, freeway interchanges, bridges, parking structures, and miles of public infrastructure. Most of it was already there before scientists clearly identified the Puente Hills Fault in 1999. That part matters. It would be easy to look back and say the city ignored the danger, but that is not really what happened. The builders did not have the information. The old geological maps did not show the fault. There was no visible crack running through downtown. No obvious scar telling engineers where the danger was. The city was not knowingly built on top of a major hidden fault. It was built first. The truth came later. By the time scientists understood what was under Los Angeles, millions of people were already living above it. Towers had been completed. Freeways were carrying traffic. Hospitals, apartments, offices, and schools were already part of the city. That is what makes the situation so difficult. You cannot simply move Los Angeles. You cannot tear down an entire city and start over. All you can do is take what already exists, figure out which parts are most vulnerable, and make them safer one structure at a time. The people who built the city were not ignoring a warning. The warning had not arrived yet. And when it finally did, most of Los Angeles was already standing. Los Angeles did eventually act. In 2015, the city approved a major retrofit program for older concrete buildings that could perform badly in a strong earthquake. But by then, it had already been 16 years since the Puente Hills Fault was clearly identified. More than 1,500 buildings were flagged for review or possible upgrades. Some of them sit close to, or directly above, parts of the fault system. That sounds like a simple problem. Find the weak buildings, reinforce them, move on. But in a city the size of Los Angeles, nothing about that process is simple. These are not empty structures waiting to be repaired. People live in them. Businesses operate inside them. Patients receive care in them. Cars fill the parking garages every day. Retrofitting one building can cost a huge amount of money. It may require engineering studies, permits, temporary closures, tenant relocation, and months of construction. Now multiply that by more than 1,000. That is why owners were given long deadlines. Some of the work may continue until around 2040. The point is not that Los Angeles did nothing. The city did respond. The problem is that the response began after most of the vulnerable buildings had already been standing for decades, and once a city is fully built, making it safer becomes a slow and expensive race. Engineers work building by building. Owners search for funding. Officials manage rules, schedules, and enforcement. Meanwhile, the fault does not pause because the paperwork is not finished. That is the uncomfortable part. The city is trying to catch up with a danger it discovered late. And every year of delay leaves more people living and working inside structures that may still need help. The biggest concern is not just that Puente Hills is active. It is that the fault may not be behaving at a steady rate. Researchers studied layers of sediment above the western part of the system, the section beneath downtown Los Angeles. Those layers act like a long-term record. Each time the fault moved, the ground above it bent a little more. New sediment was deposited on top, creating a timeline scientists could measure. What they found was unsettling. The rate of movement during the Holocene was higher than it had been during the late Pleistocene. In simple terms, the fault appears to be moving faster now than it did in the deeper past. That does not mean a major earthquake is about to happen tomorrow. It does not give scientists a date, and it cannot be used to claim that Los Angeles is days, months, or even years away from a full rupture. Earthquakes do not work that way. What the data does show is that the pattern has changed. That change could mean earthquakes are happening more often. It could mean some events are becoming larger. Or it could be a mix of both. Researchers have identified 4 major ruptures on the system during the past 11,000 years. The most recent full system event may have happened around 2,000 years ago, though the exact date is uncertain. That sounds like a long time to us. For a fault, it is not. Human beings think in years, decades, and lifetimes. Faults work on a completely different clock. They do not follow calendars. They do not care when a city was built or when a retrofit deadline ends. They simply keep taking on pressure. Slowly, quietly, one year after another. The fault is not waiting for a date on our schedule. It is just continuing to load.